Test, test, test. Hmm. Hi, there's Rosemary. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Oh, that's always good. That's always good. I always get a little nervous that there's going to be snafu. Maybe that's the optimist in me.
Nice to see you, Jordy.
Thank you, Rosemary. Um, we can just start and uh, welcome to Estate Talks. I'm George Compton. I'm the publisher of Executorium. And today we have Rosemary Watala Tromer, who is a Coloradan poet and word woman. Now, Mark Twain said the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the same as the difference between the lightning and the lightning bug. Now, is Coloradan correct or is it Coloradoan?
I would say Coloradan.
Okay, good. I think I got that right then. Excellent. So, for those listening, Rosemary is the poet of San Miguel County, Colorado, and was named Poet Laureate of Colorado's Western Slope by the Telluride Institute. So I'd invite Rosemary to start with a poem and just get us right into it if you're willing.
Yes, I'd love to. Um, so this is a poem that came out of a exercise I gave myself while I was in my own grief process. And every day I would sit down and write, "Today grief is." And on this, and I'd just be open to whatever it was. It could be a window or a chair or a tree or, and on this particular day, there was a teaspoon sitting right next to me. So today grief is a teaspoon. That was kind of the start of it. The poem is called How the Healing Happens. Again today, I dig with my teaspoon into the soil of sorrow. It is said there is healing water somewhere below. Perhaps I wished for a shovel. Perhaps there was no shovel to be found. Perhaps I did find a shovel, but the work was too heavy, too hard. It is not hard to dig one teaspoon at a time. Anyone can do it. The hole gets wider, deeper. Soon it feels like a well. It is easy work. It is the hardest work I have ever done. I thirst. Yet what heals us is not only the promised water, what heals is the work itself, dry and slow. One spoonful and another spoonful, another parched spoonful, and another.
Lovely. The This is a little different than most of our estate talks. Well, usually we're very practical and hands-on and pragmatic. But as listeners may know, that you're surrounded by these pragmatic and practical chores in a cloud of grief often. Um, and so I always circle back to grief because it is always there for executors. Everyone walks away from the gravesite differently. The executor walks away with a almost like a briefcase, which is a funny image, but it's illustrative of what's ahead for those fortunate enough to be named executor. And I'm being facetious when I say fortunate. Um, so let's talk right about writing. I think it's a catharsis for a lot of people. It was for me. Um, Rosemary, you mentioned when we were talking earlier two types of writing around this topic of grief and bereavement. Could you expand on that?
Yeah. So, for instance, the poem that I just read is one that's exploring grief itself and what is it like to be in this experience. We end up having a real intimate, profound relationship with grief. And as an experience, it changes who we are, it affects everything we do. So there's the grief itself. And the other kind of poem that we could write is a poem that explores more about the person, or I suppose in some cases the thing, but for today's purposes, the person who we're grieving, whether they were beloved or we had a very difficult relationship with them, or they were difficult and beloved. I mean, we can use writing as a way to explore that relationship in the past. But also what I've found is that when we write about that person, it allows us to continue to grow in that relationship. I think this is something I didn't know before, Jordy, about grief, was that when a person dies, the relationship isn't over, or it doesn't have to be. And that writing is one way for us to continue to grow in that relationship and our understanding of who that person is and how they continue to change our lives.
Well, that's wonderful. I concur so much that and I didn't know it either. And there's a lot I don't know, and there's a lot I continue not to know. And I when it comes to grief and losing someone, that the relationship continues is comforting to me. I think that's a very strong sentiment, and people find that out in their own way. So how do we find there I like to think there are people born with a pencil in their hand and people that are not natural writers, perhaps that might be my own categorization, but some people tend to love to write, other people not as much. So how do we find inspiration to write in a cloud of grief? It's a heavy, heavy thing above us, and putting words on paper or on a keyboard or other medium may not be so easy. So where do we
Mhm.
look for and find inspiration, excuse me. You found it in a teaspoon, which was wonderful.
Right. Well, a few thoughts about this. One is, even if you've never written before, I I think that, and you don't think of yourself as a writer, I don't think that matters, right? If you have zero experience with what it is to write, you can still sit down with a pen in your hand. It doesn't have to be a pen. You could sit and write at the computer. Some people talk into their phones. That's considered writing these days also, end up with words on a screen. So just knowing that there are going to be so many ways to do this right. You can only do it right. If you're doing it, you're doing it right. If you even just sit there and think about writing with a blank page, I feel like that's doing it right, because the writing itself is actually, I think, almost a byproduct. And part of the real practice then is just this sitting down and wondering, what's here? What's here? How am I meeting grief today? It's an invitation to just turn toward the grief and be present with it. So that's my first thought, is know that you don't even have to write. Maybe it's the intention to write is actually good enough. But if you do write, that whatever you do is the right thing to do. And the invitation that I always give myself is, it doesn't have to be any good. It just has to be true. In fact, I sit down and I tell myself, don't write anything good, because sometimes that feels like pressure. If the moment we feel pressure, then we shut down. So
Right.
for me, the whole idea here is, how do we open up? How do we allow writing to be a tool that helps us to open to loss, to
Mhm.
exploring the one who's gone, to exploring what's happening with me now, what is it like to be alive in this moment, that when I'm hurting, and to know that grief takes on so many different kinds of experiences, right? So that's part of why I like this little phrase that I have. Today grief is and it doesn't, and it could also be today grief is, and you could fill it in with an adjective, right? Today grief is exhausting. Today grief is anger. Today grief is self-compassion. And then to notice how much it changes over time. And in this way, the more we try and write, knowing that we're not going to just sit down and do it all once, right? You're not going to write it. You're not going to sit down and you're going to write the definitive poem of my grief. That isn't going to happen. But to know that you could sit down again and again and again, and each time explore some new facet, or maybe you explore the exact same thing you explored yesterday, 2 years ago, and you're like, oh yeah, it's coming back again and again, and know that that's part of it too.
Yeah, I always, as I'm working on Executorium and it's organic, I tell myself it's a process. It's not an event. I'm not creating Executorium today. I'm creating Executorium over a time frame, and it's, never going to be finished. So it's the process of always trying to put and find resources in front of executors that are going through this time frame and this, set of responsibilities. So I would approach writing much the same way. It's You're going to sit down, you're going to have your journal, and everything's going to be right, and the coffee's going to be there, and it's not always perfect. So it's just the process is what's beautiful, and just having a little courage to make that time for yourself. I think probably has very interesting and different results for many, many people. And your area is poetry. You're a poet. What about prose and journaling and blogging? Any thoughts in that regard to help, people see, different channels to get those get those thoughts out of your head and get it out there?
Yeah. Well, like you say, Jordy, there's so many ways to do it right. Whether you're blogging or whether you're journaling or whether you're, writing on a napkin or, like, I think we're all going to find what's working for me. And I think we all also find this isn't working for me. Although it could take a while before we really know, it could take a few moments. One thing that I do love about poetry is that it is image driven often. So it's like, it's both a bridge between what's happening outside and what's happening inside. That's not to say other kinds of writing can't do that also, but as opposed to just recording, this is what happened, which sometimes a journal can be like that. In addition to the recording of the events, or this is what I saw, there's another invitation to, and this is how I feel, or this is what I notice about that, or this is why that matters. And that little extra piece, I think, can be what opens us up. We're like, oh, that's why, so
Yeah.
they loved my father gave me a microscope when I was very young. And just this last week, I was writing a poem about the microscope that my dad gave me, and I associate the microscope with my dad. And then I realized, oh, what he gave me wasn't just a microscope. He gave me the ability to see things in new ways, this drive to be curious, this, wonder at the invisible, what's happening beneath what we can see. So you see how I took the opportunity to write about the microscope, but then it's that next leap into, kind of crassly, I suppose, so what? That's what helps develop the relationship then with this person who's gone, is, oh, look what he really gave me, much more than a microscope.
So you didn't know it was a metaphor when you put pen to paper, and then
Oh,
putting pen to
no.
paper helped you see that. Well, there's the catharsis right there.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Speaking of dads, and my dad's been gone longer than he was here for me anyway. It's been a long time. But I was quite young, and I was a bit euphoric after he passed. It was an illness, and I was guilty about that. And so I wrote that down, and then I put a match to it, and I burned it up. But it had been said, and went up to the went up to the heavens, such as it were. And but putting it into print was helpful. And uh, whatever your outcome, there's so many different channels and so many different ways to approach this. I think it's always helpful, and it's active, and grief is often so inactive. Um, you're just wondering, what can I do about this? So the program, Writing into Grief, that Evermore sponsors, that you host, uh, just, you know, rang my bell, because it is something you can actually do, and writing, and it doesn't take anything really to just put down a few lines or many pages. It doesn't matter. It's an action you can take in a situation where there's not a lot of not a lot of action to be taken. So I just wanted to say that Rosemerry is the poet laureate of Evermore. I didn't mention that. Evermore is a 501(c)(3) organization whose mission is to examine and advocate for bereavement leave. And FYI, currently only 5 states have bereavement leave, and 2 have pending legislation. So um, what I was talking about previously was the Writing into Grief program. So, apart from their advocacy to advance the cost for bereavement legislation, they offer support and resources for the grieving. And Rosemerry is the a host and guide and teacher, um, guru of their writing program. So their next workshop is September 4th. So, Rosemerry, what can people expect on September 4th at the Writing into Grief workshop?
Mhm. So first I'll say maybe one thing that won't happen is we won't fix anything, right? And we're not going to make it all better, and we're not trying to, you know, we're not going to make it all fine. That I just want to say that writing about grief isn't going to fix things, but that's not its point either. So when we come together and do writing around grief, in these particular workshops, I'll talk just a little bit about the writing process. We'll read poems about grief. We'll talk about them a little bit. And then I'll offer some ideas for writing. People will go off and have 15 minutes to do some writing on their own or not writing. I'm always very, like I already said, if you just sit there, that's also just good. Just sit there and notice what's here. Not writing is a big part of writing. We'll come back. We'll talk about process. We'll do the whole thing again. We'll go off and have a chance for people to share if they wish, but no one ever has to share. And there'll be small groups possible, or there's also a possibility to have to stay in a larger group and talk about process, and then have a closing where we wonder about what we're taking away. So it's a very safe group. I do everything I can to make sure that people understand that no matter where they're at with their grief, no matter where they're at with their writing process, whether they've won a Pulitzer Prize or last time they wrote a poem was, or even thought about a poem was in high school, that's all fine. It doesn't matter wherever they're at. We have wide open arms and a way to hold them in that process, and invite them to see what would happen. What would happen if I showed up and turned toward grief with a pen in my hand?
Like that. What would happen? So there's only one way to find out, and put that pen in your hand. I think it'll surprise many of the people listening. I encourage it, if I can be so bold. Um, Rosemerry, why do you write? General.
Yeah, what a good question. The main reason that I do write a poem every day, and the reason I do is because I've noticed it completely changes the way I see the world. It invites an awareness, a curiosity, a sense of wonder. Again and again, the question every time I sit down to write, I wonder, what's here? what's here? What's happening outside? What's happening inside? Over time, that that translates to how I am out in the world. The way you are, the way you do one thing is the way you do everything, right? So the way that I practice meeting a blank page turns out to be the same way that I practice meeting a new space, the way that I try on a new job, the way that I meet a new person. So I feel like the writing practice is a practice of showing up and in wonder and curiosity and openness.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe one more poem before we part, if you have one handy.
I thought I'd read one that's the other kind of poem that we talked about, which is a poem that's really looking at uh, the person looking at oh, except I just lost it. Hold on one second. Come back, poem. Oh, okay, I'll have to forgive me. It just went
No
away.
worries. That's what editing is all about.
All right. I don't know how I pressed a button that made it disappear, but that's what I did.
That's usually what I do. So while Rosemary's looking, you can visit evermore.org for more information on the September 4th Writing into Grief workshop. And also visit evermore.org for information on what is the state of bereavement leave and legislation. And there's so many different facets of that. I had a friend who I understood when his father had just passed away and he was working a lot of hours. He was a very high pressured position. And I just said, what's up with that? Doesn't your company have any provisions for you to take some time? And he just looked at me and said, they don't care. And that was it. So that's the end of conversation. So I suppose you can voice your opposition with your feet, but do that and try to put milk on the table at the same time may have conflicting gravities. So um, it's a difficulty for a lot of people. So we're happy that Evermore's exploring that frontier. So how do we do, Rosemary? Did we find
I
our
found it.
poem?
I
Excellent.
found it. Thank you, Jordy. Forgive me for
All good.
having my fingers hit the wrong thing. So this is a poem then that is about looking at a photograph. And there are many ways I think that we can find a way into writing about a loved one. One of them is to take an object of theirs and write about the object, like I talked about with the microscope with my father. In this case, I'm looking at a picture of my son, and I allow that curiosity about what's happening in the picture, and then what does it bring up in me? It's called Getting Close. In the photo, he is dancing, his arms a strong diagonal, his tie flying forward, even as he comes to a still point, balanced for a moment on the toes of his tap shoes, his body a lightning bolt in a crisp white shirt. I focus on his face, see the will it takes to make his body stop in time, see his easy smile, the invitation in his eyes, a blend of pride and play. I lean in until his face is a blur, as if by coming closer I might feel the breath that isn't there. Breathe in the warmth of his being. I love entering this photo sometimes, or more rightly, love the way this photo enters me, until I ring with the truth of how it is to love this boy who did not become a man, this boy who chose to make his body stop in time, this lightning bolt captured on film, unpredictable, powerful, something no one could hold forever, this love that strikes me every time I think of him. I still feel it, the charge.
Well, that's lovely. And if that doesn't put us into that space, that very, very difficult space that you're brave to share with us and bring us there with you. I certainly was. So I thank you for your gift. And with that, we're going to not have a better place to leave it. Thank you, Rosemerry, and thank you, Evermore, for helping executors with their grief. Every estate is different, and grief is different for everyone. So explore your path to healing and peace. And thank you for listening. And thank you, Rosemerry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordy.